Good evening from Boston College. I am Kathleen Caveney and I teach in the law school and in the theology department here at BC. I welcome you to the show at 6, BC and the Common Good. The show at 6 features friends and members of the BC community discussing a range of issues affecting our world today, all revolving around the theme of the common good. Topics include how the BC community is responding to the effects of COVID-19, to the enduring challenges of the marginalized, to our own resiliency and solidarity, and to the upbuilding of human dignity throughout the world. The show is based on the central insight of the common good. That is, that the resources that humanity has and needs must be shared equitably. For instance, today, each of us is called to promote the common good by social distancing, by wearing masks, by washing our hands. These practices, like other forms of solidarity, are not only for our own good, but also for the common good. So tonight, our show will proceed as follows. At 6:40, my co-host and I will ask our guests questions from the audience. Members of the audience can pose a question before 6:40 p.m. via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Let me repeat that. Members of the audience can pose a question before 6:40 p.m. via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. They should identify themselves by their name and by their relationship to BC. My co-host this evening is Gregory Kalscheur, a Jesuit priest and the Dean of the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences. Father Kalscheur is also a law professor. He joined the BC Law faculty in 2003. His primary teaching and research interests include law and religion, constitutional law, civil procedure, Catholic social thought and the law, and the contributions of Ignatian spirituality to the character of legal education at a Jesuit law school. He has carried his deep interdisciplinarity and his humanistic interest to his new position as Dean of the Morrissey College, a position he has held on a permanent basis since 2015. Our guest tonight is Vincent D. Rougeau, the Dean of Boston College Law School. He is also the president of the Association of American Law Schools, in which he has served in a wide variety of leadership positions. Dean Rougeau writes and speaks extensively on legal education reform. He's also an expert in Catholic social thought. Dean Rougeau's current research and writing consider the relationship between religious identity and notions of democratic citizenship and membership in highly mobile and increasingly multicultural democratic societies. He is also the founding director of the Boston College Forum on Racial Justice in America, established last month on the initiative of Father President Leahy. So welcome tonight, and let's get to the questions. I will yield to my co-host, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and then we'll go to the Dean of the Law School.
Thanks, Kathy. It's great to be with you and Vince tonight, and welcome to all our attendees. I thought we'd start with a sort of general question about the concept of the common good. As we know, the common good has a prominent role in the history of Jesuit education and in BC's current understanding of its mission. Historically, Jesuit education has aimed to integrate intellectual rigor and formation of character with the goal of enabling students to contribute to the common good of society. When we talk about the core curriculum for undergraduates, I often explain to people that we hope the core helps students become well prepared for meaningful lives oriented towards service of the common good. And in our strategic plan for the university, we've made a commitment to expand support for scholarship and research in keeping with the university's mission to help address complex societal problems and contribute to the common good. So Vince, how would you explain what this idea of the common good means?
Well, it's a big question. Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Kathy. It's great to be with you both tonight. The common good, well, here I am not being a good Zoomer with my phone ringing. The common good, I think, is a concept that I think all of us know is often really difficult to define. But I think one thing we're trying to do here at BC is to take students who are coming into higher education, obviously with some understanding, or developing an understanding about who they are themselves and what they want for themselves, and then maybe enriching that understanding with an idea of, as you develop an understanding of your education, as you develop an understanding of your role in a particular profession, say in the law school, how do you fit into this broader notion of what we do as members of a society, as members of a profession, as people who contribute to different kinds of organizations, as people who are members of families? In other words, we engage as individuals in a structure, in environments of community. And, we have to understand that those environments, those communities, those organizations, those professions in which we participate are things of themselves. And they aren't just collections of individuals. They actually have sort of an organic meaning that, we as participants give it, but we also sort of recognize it as something separate from what we are, or what we are doing individually. So that may mean, for instance, that from time to time, we have to understand how we might check our individual ambitions or our individual desires in an effort to promote the larger common, the larger good, from which we would all benefit in various ways. So, it's not an easy thing to comprehend in one fell swoop. But I think as part of one's experience as, progressing through an undergraduate education or professional education, it becomes clearer through the process of the various courses we take and the various things that you participate in as a member of a university community.
Let me pick up on that. What the audience may not know is that Greg, Vince, and I have known each other a long time because we are all working at a particular intersection of law, ethics, and Catholic social teaching from different angles, sometimes bringing different particular experience there, but really interested in the same questions. Vince wrote an important book, a very important book, on Christians in the American Empire, faith and citizenship in the New World Order, for example. But a lot of people don't think that law has anything to do with ethics. They think that our little set of interests is, it is just very, very odd. So maybe you could tell us, Vince, a little bit about your journey, how you decided to become a lawyer, how you decided to move into the legal academy, and how your own experience led you to work on the questions of social justice and equity that you are now so deeply dedicated to.
Sure. Well, like for many of us, it was a circuitous journey. But, I became interested in the law, like a lot of people, because, I have a father who's a lawyer. But my father became interested in law as a vehicle of promoting social justice, because he was very involved in the civil rights movement, as was my mother. And so they knew sort of from that experience that the law was an important part of building a just society. And so, that was sort of the ecosystem in which I lived as a child. But when I went to law school, like a lot of people who go to law school, you kind of get drawn into a pathway that often leads you to big law firms or government work at a very high level. And that's what I did. I worked for a big law firm in Washington, D.C., and I was doing something that really didn't seem at all connected to social justice. I was doing banking law.
Turns out it is, though, right?
Well, there you go, right? Because, as I got involved in banking law from the regulatory structure it's really the regulatory structure of the financial system, it really became clear to me that, if we only understand the financial system from kind of a law and economics perspective, or a purely capitalist perspective, we are doing extreme damage to the common good, because we aren't understanding the culture and the people who are, making those financial decisions. And at the time, it was the early 1990s, and the market-based understanding of efficiency, and that the idea that efficiency is actually the best way to promote people's good, it's not so much the common good, but their individual goods, was very ascendant and very dominant. And the idea that, well, you might actually check the market, or you might actually constrain the market in some meaningful way because that promotes other goods. Well, it was very hard for that message to be communicated. And what ended up happening is, we totally deregulated our financial system at that time or during that time. Now, I got interested in those academic questions, so I left the firm and moved into teaching. But the reason I was interested in those questions is because I was very troubled by what I saw as the potentially the ultimate negative effects that were going to come about because of this sort of massive deregulation, the taking away of a lot of the checks on what financial institutions can do to make money. And lo and behold, not just because I thought of it, because a lot of people were thinking of it, but over the course of 20 years, we saw the collapse of a financial system almost that had become completely disconnected to the needs of the common good, to the needs of people, to the other values that might sort of, temper the desire to make money or the desire to make profits.
Vincent, talking about that individual desire to make money or make profits, it sort of leads into the idea of how the law operates or can operate to prioritize individual rights sometimes, and that might be in tension with the commitment to the community that's part of understanding the common good. American law is sometimes understood as really putting an emphasis on individual rights and doing a good job protecting individual rights. Is that in tension with ideas of the common good, or how do we talk about the common good in the context of the American legal system and the American legal culture?
Yeah, it's difficult sometimes to tease out whether or not it's the law that's driving us to be more individualistic because of the way it's structured, or is it because this is just a very individualistic society that produces a legal system that reflects that? It's probably a mixture of both. I think most of us come into this world understanding the basic notion of the common good as participants in families, for instance. I mean, we get some kind of rough notion of the fact that I don't get to do everything I want because, the family itself also has needs. And sometimes I have to sort of repress my personal desires for the benefit of everyone else in the household. And we're also parts of other kinds of communities, be they religious organizations, social organizations, or whatever. And those things matter to us in our communities, in our lives. But what's happened in the United States over, the last 50 years has been a real kind of undervaluing or kind of undermining of those other commitments we may have to other types of social or community organizations in deference to our individual desires and needs. I mean, we have seen a kind of glorification in our culture and in our economy and in in our law of the benefits that can be produced by allowing individuals to just press as hard as possible towards the things that they want for themselves, liberating individuals from the constraints of culture, family, community, and allowing people to sort of decide for themselves what they want. And some of that is rooted in the unique story of how the United States was formed, people leaving other countries and seeking something for themselves. By releasing themselves from their community, they were able to find justice, to practice their religion, to do things that they weren't able to do in their home countries. And so we tend to glamorize this notion of individualism, but at the same time, that story of individualism was happening in a country that still, had chattel slavery and was doing a lot of other things that were in, direct contradiction to that story. So we sometimes forget the complexity of our own story, and the law sometimes runs amok, I think, and, develops practices and processes that overvalue individualism until there's a disaster like 2008, and then we try to pull it back with regulation. So it's this pendulum. But I think what we need to spend more time doing as a society in the United States is remembering kind of core notions of what we need to do in common, how we need to understand and protect and preserve communal aspects of our lives together and value them and elevate them, not, to the complete destruction of our individual needs and desires, but to balance them And we don't really have a way of speaking so often on, how do we use the law to balance the needs of individuals against the needs of the community and to create, benefits, on both sides, to balance rights, for instance, with obligations.
Just to follow up briefly on that, you, Kathy, and I have all spent a lot of time in the law school world. Do you think the way we study and teach the law contributes to this glamorization, perhaps, of individualism or individual rights?
I do sometimes worry that the American model of legal education overly glamorized the notion of sort of the appellate lawyer who is charging forward, breaking all the rules because using his or her fierce intellect to come up with that one argument that, sort of rocks everybody's worlds and changes the whole notion of how we understand what is right and what is fair, and we're protecting the innocent, or, sort of challenging norms. And, if you spend too much time thinking that way, people don't want to cooperate with each other to learn because they want to be that one, they want to be that person. And sometimes our back and forth in the Socratic method also does that. It creates this notion that, you want to be the smartest person in the room. You want to be the one who gets every answer right, and to impress the professor in a way that sort of demonstrates that, you are going to be the hero,
But
and
don't you think that just that law, I think that's true about law education. I wonder, what was your experience of practicing law? Because, what I found when the couple of years that I spent in legal practice was how collaborative the actual practice of law is versus, legal education. There'd be a complicated deal you'd be doing, and, the corporate person would say, well, don't do this yourself. Go talk to this person in tax who can tell you what to do there. And there was a much more of a sense that, being a good associate was knowing which people to ask which questions. So, so there are aspects of collaboration, in the practice of law. Maybe the problem is we don't highlight them enough.
No, I think that's a great point, Kathy. And actually, I want to be sure to say that I think over the last decade in particular, we've done a lot in legal education to, sort of temper what I think was, a kind of, an extreme version of what we did. I mean, not a completely unfair one, but in the past. But I do think, for just what you were saying, we have spent a lot more time in recent years thinking about how we as legal educators can be more in touch with what is happening in the profession and how people actually, practice and live out their careers as lawyers. And it's exactly as you say. I mean, most people don't make a career in the law by being sort of, the Lone Ranger and, or this appellate hero. But we didn't always structure law school in a way that sort of emphasized that. And one of the things we heard from the profession is we want to have students who come into law firms understanding exactly how we work and how we collaborate and why that's important, and how being a team player really is essential to being a successful lawyer. So again, I think it's sort of the same tension we see sometimes in the culture, right, between individualism and the common good and community. It's these sort of exaggerated notions that often get a lot of attention, but in actual fact, that's not how the everyday practice of law works or how life works in general.
Let's switch maybe to the reason we're all having this conversation on Zoom, right? Which is the coronavirus pandemic. We'd be all in a non-socially distanced, packed in, lecture hall on the campus if we weren't, dealing with the coronavirus. How do you think the coronavirus has changed the way we think about, individualism, communities, and even different levels of communities? So when you think about the common good, you've got the national common good, but then you have different states. And the US, has struggled to articulate, an effective national response to the pandemic. But some states like Massachusetts seem to have worked out an effective way forward, while other states like those in the South and in the West are struggling a bit more now. these variations that may seem to be part of the, or a reflection of the federalism that's part of our constitutional system. What do you think about the relationship between federalism, the relationship between the state governments and the national government and the common good in the pandemic context? Is it a help or is it a hindrance to promoting the common good? Should we abolish states and just have one nation? Should we get rid of a big national government and just have states? Or do we just need to tweak things a bit?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, but let's take it in smaller parts, right? I do think what we are seeing in the United States with the pandemic is a great example of where we began this conversation about, individualism and the common good. It just has to be said that the United States as a society does have a problem when it comes to certain views about the autonomy of the individual. And we're seeing the result of that problem in the sense that we have a very difficult time coming together as a nation when it involves making sacrifices. Americans, many Americans, I want to be clear on this, clearly are not able or willing to make sacrifices for other members of the society that they believe infringe on their personal freedoms. And that tendency is particularly strong culturally in the South and the West. And our colleague Heather Cox Richardson has written a very interesting book on this point. And I think folks should take a look at it if they're interested in this question. But the evidence is there for us to all see, right? We heard the leaders in those states make very clear the notion that they would not impose on their citizens mandates to do something that we all know would slow the spread of this disease, because they are prioritizing individual freedom over the checks on those freedoms that would allow more people to survive this pandemic. Now contrast that with what we've seen in New England and the Middle Atlantic states on the West Coast. It's clear that culturally and politically, the leaders of those states felt much more willing to take sometimes rather draconian steps to protect the health of the entire community. And people were more willing to accept them. They didn't accept them without argument, but they were much more willing to accept them. And the results have been plain. I mean, the virus is under better control, not complete control, but better control in this part of the country than it is in the parts of the country that we just described. It's also in better control in Europe for the same reason, because people were willing to make sacrifices for the common good, for the good of the community, that may have involved them, repressing personal and individual desires or opportunities that they themselves, even though they were unlikely to become victims of this disease. But that wasn't the question, right? The issue was, or the question was, how do we preserve the life of the community, not how do we preserve particular individuals' needs and desires, and what will we all have to sacrifice to do that? So when you think about federalism versus, a strong central government, it may go back to what we were talking about when we were discussing law and culture, right? I don't know, this country may be too big to impose a giant federal mandate on every part of the country to do the same thing, but it does appear that there needs to be some ability for the federal government to, give authority and support to those states who wish, and those regions of the country that seem to think that it's important to create, a community-based response to fight this pandemic. The problem, of course, is if we don't all do it, we don't really get the benefits across the entire nation. But maybe that's not possible when cultures within one country are so divergent.
That's true.
Vince, in the midst of the pandemic, we're also finding ourselves in a national moment of, again, reckoning with racial injustice and the way in which the law has kind of had an ambiguous relationship with this whole question of race in the U.S. and a history of entrenching injustice in slavery, and then after the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, the law operating to promote racial justice, but still incompletely and not successfully. And we've got a lot still to work on. In this moment, you've been appointed the inaugural director of the Boston College Forum on Racial Justice in America, which I'm really happy about. I think it's a tremendous initiative, and I'm glad that you're taking the lead in that. What are your thoughts on kind of why it's been difficult for the law to be more effective in shaping a more racially just American society? And does our maybe ambiguous relationship with the common good have a role to play in that? What can we do better on that front?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Greg. And I do think our, sort of tortured relationship with the common good has a lot to say about that. When we look at the issues of racism in the United States, we've got to be more honest about the idea of structural racism and the fact that racism permeates the way that society has been built because of the history of slavery and because of Jim Crow and because of all of these things that were kind of baked into the system. And it's been very, very difficult, obviously, for Americans, for white Americans in particular, many of them, to release themselves from this notion that, well, I don't have any personal responsibility for what happened in the past, or I myself do not engage personally in racism or racist actions. So why do I have to, deal with this problem? And why do my needs have to be sort of limited or checked, or my desires, in an effort to fight this ism, this sin of racism that, I didn't commit, at least. I don't believe I did. And so a lot of what we're talking about right now is how we all participate in a structure that is engaged in racial injustice and that is repressing people due to a history of racism that's just part of of American culture and American society. And I think more and more people are starting to understand that because they're seeing more evidence of it in ways that are shocking to them. And it's not that these things weren't there before. I mean, people of color have been talking about these things, but actually now seeing them on cell phone camera footage and just, the horror, the level of horror. I mean, to watch a man be murdered, suffocated for 8 minutes is something that's just horrible for anyone to see. And it's hard to explain it other than what it was, So I think that's giving people a better way to start to say that, oh, wait a minute, this is a societal problem and we are all responsible for it. If we're either participating in it or we're working to fix it. And this is a societal problem that our Catholic tradition, I think, has a lot to speak about, has a lot of language that speaks to it. I mean, this notion of structural sin, the notion of, institutions or communities having these broader responsibilities is something that the Catholic tradition speaks to and can discuss very well. And so we don't think only in individualistic terms when we think about how we should behave towards one another, what our responsibilities are in community. And this is something where I think a Jesuit Catholic university has a lot to offer a society that tends to overvalue individualism. Because we can say, well, actually, it's true. If a society has been built on slavery and racial discrimination over centuries, you can't just throw up your hands and say, well, I didn't do it, and not still yourself be participating in what we would say in our tradition is sin. So, I think we have a great opportunity here to take real moral leadership on an issue that is at the heart of who we are as Americans. This society must reckon with this. It is baked into who we are. It's baked into every institution. It's baked into our legal system. It's baked into our economy. It's baked into our criminal justice system. So if we all attack it, we actually might be able to change it.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, you very perceptively and helpfully invoke kind of the challenge that Catholic social teaching provides to prevailing American understandings of individual rights and individual responsibilities by focusing on the common good. There's another area I think that'd be helpful to hear you speak about, where Catholic social teaching challenges prevailing American norms, that really cuts across both the coronavirus situation and just this explosion of necessary attention to the pervasive racism in the country, which is our understanding of rights. The American legal system might be described as good at protecting negative rights. Leave me alone. I'm an individual. Just leave me my fenced-in area. Freedom from government interference with speech or property or even religious exercise. But it's not very good at protecting positive rights: a right to health care, a right to housing, a right to education. All of that, I think, has come to the fore in addressing not only systemic racism, but also systemic inequality around race in the way the epidemic has harmed people. How do you think a greater appreciation for the common good, as articulated even in Catholic social teaching, might influence our thinking about the role of law and public policy in promoting greater access to health care or affordable housing among historically disadvantaged groups, especially people of color?
Yeah, that's really, really important. And I think what this conversation about race and racial injustice can do for us is to give us a very clear example of what it means when rights are given through law, but the structures of the society make it impossible or very difficult for people to actually exercise those rights in any meaningful way, or to really get any meaningful advantage from those rights being extant. So if people are forced into poor housing conditions because the structures of the economy really make it very difficult for them to access good housing, the benefits that we associate with home ownership and living in nice neighborhoods, which often are related to educational opportunities, will not be accessed by them. If people are routinely in situations where their health is compromised and the society provides very little opportunity for them to really get the kind of health care they need when they need it, for instance, particularly in the early stages of life where it can really matter and where good habits can be developed, the idea that, hey, you can go to any doctor you want, well, that's meaningless if you can't afford it or if your health is so poor that no doctor will take you. So, we have insisted in this country, or we have chosen in this country, not to invest broadly in those kinds of things, or not to provide a right to things at the base of our common lives together that would actually allow people to develop in ways that would make our individualistic approaches to some other rights, the negative rights, would matter or seem more useful to people who actually had a chance to develop meaningful opportunities to participate in society. But if you don't even have a meaningful opportunity to participate, you don't have education, you don't have healthcare, you don't have housing. The fact that you have freedom of speech seems pretty hollow, because you're just trying to survive, or you can barely survive. So when you see how racism has disfigured this society and how racism has done that for people of color, particularly for Black people in the United States, in terms of limiting their ability to exercise the rights that people say we have, and you start to get it, then you can see more broadly why it's really important to recognize that we need probably a broader network of rights and a richer understanding of rights, such as the one that Catholic social teaching provides, to really be thinking about how we're going to build not only a better functioning democracy, but a more just democracy and a fairer society.
That will allow everybody to contribute to the common good. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about Catholic social teaching, what I appreciate so much about it, is that the idea of it isn't just to allow everybody to get. It's to allow everybody to get in order to give. That we want to enable people to contribute their gifts to the broader society. They get their flourishing and the community gets its flourishing at the same time, because the good of the individuals and the good of the whole community are ultimately inseparable. And so we've lost so much, we've lost, racism has made us lose, not only the flourishing of the individuals who are people, members of, people of color, but also the gifts they could bring to the broader community. It's a double loss.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many other ways that we could value membership in the community beyond the sort of market-based and individual-based ones that we tend to raise up, right? If people felt that they had the housing they needed and the healthcare that they needed, maybe they wouldn't feel so compelled to make money any way they possibly could. Maybe they would be able to flourish in other ways as people engaged in the arts or living in nature and supporting the environment. I mean, there's so many other things that our communities need that don't necessarily involve, participation in the market economy, raising children, taking care of the elders. In a society that values people in other ways and gives them support in other ways, people can take on those roles and don't feel that, well, I can't take care of old people because I need a job that pays money, that more money than that will pay me, or I need a job, instead of saying, well, there are other ways I can find support through community that don't require me to participate in the marketplace as a person who earns a wage. It's just lays the groundwork for a much richer understanding of how people participate in the life of a society.
Thank you.
Maybe before turning to the questions from participants, thinking about the richness of participation in society and often the diversity that can exist in our societies, and how do we think about the common good in our pluralistic societies? Can there be sort of a tension between pluralism and the common good? It may be easy to think about the good of the community in a homogeneous community, but in a more pluralistic setting, are there tensions there? And I know you've been part of the Just Communities Project, which explores the role of religious communities in community organizing and the formation of democratic citizens in pluralistic, multicultural neighborhoods in East London. What have you learned about pluralism and the common good from working with that project?
Yeah, that's been a great experience for me, because it's really shown me just how wonderful diverse communities can be in terms of building spaces where people can live together and appreciate the other members of their communities and build relationships with those members of the community, other members of the community, without necessarily all believing and sharing in the exact same thing in terms of religious beliefs or other beliefs. Because most people who come together in a geographic community, in a society, want the same things, right? We want to be able to, find meaningful employment. We want to be able to raise our children in safety. We want to be able to live in dignity. And, nobody wants to be victims of crime. No one wants to be the victim of, sort of state-sanctioned violence. And when people live together in community, they often find that they share a lot of desires for the same things, and they can build coalitions to work to get those things. And when you do that, when people build those coalitions as part of a civil society, as part of civic engagement, they build respect for one another, and they can live together despite differences of, say, faith, because most faiths don't teach that you're supposed to go out and destroy other members of other faiths. And most people who come to a place like London or New York want to be part of the vibrancy and the dynamism that those communities allow for, and the opportunities that they present. And I think people know how to manage a lot of their differences in peaceful ways, and just want the space to be able to do that. They want to be able to live out their system of beliefs without being, controlled or imposed upon in ways that make it impossible to do that. And sure, there are going to be some times when things butt up against each other. But when you've built relationships through a shared commitment to, say, safety in your community or quality education, you're going to be much less likely to see that person who's a different religion or who, comes from a different part of the world as an enemy or a threat. You're just going to see them as different. And, that's how God made us, right? He made us all to be different. But that doesn't mean we can't really live together and thrive. And I have to believe, and I do firmly believe, that diverse societies are stronger societies, just like diverse ecosystems in nature are stronger ecosystems.
Well, that's wonderful. And part of the BC community and the community of this event is that we've got some fabulous questions to ask you from our audience. And the first is from Daniel Cocolette, the Monin professor in the law school. And I quote, "We have recently seen deployment of quasi-military units, neither police, National Guard, or regular military. In places like Portland, the purpose seems to be a law and order political argument. What do you think is the right strategy to oppose this ominous development? One approach is to phase back demonstrations for social justice to avoid political confrontation favorable to this political strategy. But is not this a success in suppressing racial or suppressing by intimidation? What do we do?"
Well, that's a hard question. I mean, first of all, I guess I would say this is a country in which we claim to believe that we have a right to peaceful protest, and most of these protests have been relatively peaceful, and so the fact that the government sees fit to bring in paramilitary units, which almost always around the world we see this all the time, become instigators of more violence, seems to suggest that this is not an attempt to quell violence. It's an attempt to create violence so that now you can be justified in sending in even more even stronger measures to control the demonstrations. So we've seen this throughout history. We saw this with the civil rights movement too in the 60s, and so we need to be able to think of ways to allow local governments and people closest to those situations to work with protesters to create opportunities for them to protest peacefully. And if there's additional help needed, then that's for those local governments to determine, and then they can ask for it. But the fact that the federal government is on its own authorities sort of sending in people that have not been asked for is a sign, I think, that it's a solution in search of a problem. And
what's interesting about your response to that question too is that that's another key piece of Catholic social teaching, the principle of subsidiarity, which
absolutely.
says you settle things at a local level if possible, and it's generally better. So settling disputes between protesters and law enforcement is much more easily done justly if it's done at the local level than if you send in the national paramilitary forces. You want to take the next one, Greg?
I will. And thinking about the local and the BC context, perhaps, I want to take a question from Eric Owens in Theology and International Studies here at BC. Eric says this: "Thank you, Vince, for agreeing to lead the BC Forum on Racial Justice. I'd love to hear how this effort will take up specific issues at Boston College that Black students have been expressing amidst the broader conversation about racial justice in recent years. I know there's much to discuss about broader themes, but also much to work on here at BC." So how will the BC Forum on Racial Justice take up BC specific issues?
So I think the first thing we want to do in the forum locally at BC, and that hopefully this will begin in the fall, is to host and sponsor what I'm calling restorative justice conversations, using the model of restorative justice to allow people in the BC community to express situations and to describe, things that have happened to them here in this community, and why those things are really damaging and why they need to be addressed. And so that they can also articulate why they need to have some understanding from the university, from this community, that, they will be brought into meaningful membership. Because a lot of the things that we're hearing from students and others is hearkening back to what we were discussing earlier, right? I don't feel that I can meaningfully participate in this community as a member because I am being minimized, dehumanized, marginalized in ways relating to race. And I'm not getting any kind of sense that people are able to deal with that in an effective way that will bring me back into meaningful relationship or bring me even into meaningful relationship for the first time. And what restorative justice does is it's not just, let me tell you the bad thing that happens to me. It's also, here's what I want to tell you, but here's also what I think would help heal the situation. Here's how we can make justice happen. And it draws people together in conversation about solutions and justice moving forward. So that's work we do need to do in our own community first. And that's work that will involve people who know how to manage and direct these conversations. So I'm hoping we can do those locally in schools and other places across the campus. It's not like a big conversation you have for the whole university, although I think we'll do something like that to model the process. But that's where I think the work begins. And from there, we start to then reach out with ideas and other things that we'd like to do beyond BC.
Yeah, I think those conversations will be challenging, but also a really rich opportunity to build the community and have a deeper sense of the common good in our university community. So
absolutely
important. Kathy?
Well, I've got another question that's taking things more to how do we create community with people who seem quite divided from us. It's from Judy McMorrow, who's a professor in the law school. And I quote, "For many who oppose masks, it sounds like they challenge the factual foundation. If you are lying to me, then there's no need to use masks. For some, this may not be a clash of values. Sure, I'd sacrifice for others if it's necessary, but it isn't. But of facts, it isn't factually needed. How do we deal with disagreement on facts in a society punctuated by deep, deep distrust?"
Yeah, I mean, that's a real problem because we've reached a point in this society where people don't believe that experts are actually delivering factual information that does not have a political or other agenda behind it. And I think we're going to have to start looking closely at what has happened in this country where there have been individuals in positions of power who have made it their business to undermine the kind of consensus we've long had around the notion that when people devote their lives to learning about things, to becoming expert in something, that we will accord them some degree of deference because they know more. The idea that people attack Dr. Anthony Fauci, this is a man who's worked for 6 presidents. This is a man who was the top of his class at Cornell Medical School. He's done nothing but serve this country his entire career, his entire life. His family's being threatened because he's telling the truth. Yet there are people who believe that he is not presenting facts. I mean, I don't know how you really address that. I mean, we in universities, our whole existence is about giving people the tools to become expert at things. And if the society in which we do that does not want to accord them the deference that the sacrifices they've made financially, personally, and otherwise to acquire that knowledge, if those things are meaningless to our fellow citizens, I don't know what you do. I mean, that strikes me as a society that's in deep dysfunction. When that kind of anti-knowledge becomes so pervasive that it seems like it's politically reasonable to believe that someone like Anthony Fauci is lying when he tells people to wear masks.
What do you think the internet does to that, Vince? I mean, the whole question of, all 3 of us were raised in a pre-internet era. Your kids, Vince, were raised, and they're so much more comfortable with the internet than anybody born, roughly our era is. How has the internet changed what counts as a fact, do you think? Is that an issue that maybe we all in academia need to take up, including those who work at the intersection of law and Catholic social teaching?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, for us, it was really hard to acquire knowledge. You had to work really hard to find it. You had to spend time in the library. You had to fall asleep in the library. You had to wake up in the library. Now you can just Google it, right? But one of the things that I hope, are trying to teach our students, and what I try to teach my children is, sure, there's a lot of information out there. Now what you need to be better at is how to discern sources of information. I mean, what sources of information are reliable or, better than others? And how, and this is a hard question, right? How do we determine that some sources are sources that, we can feel fairly confident and trusting, others are not? I mean, the idea that a lot of people are getting their information about politics off of Facebook, and that is, it's very easy for the Russian government to, influence American voters because so many of them believe anything they read on Facebook. So, that's about sources. Like, why would you just assume that something you read on Facebook is true, as opposed to saying, well, that's interesting. That seems kind of challenging. Let me see if other people are saying this too. I mean, so one of the things, of course, we do in law school, which maybe makes us a little less susceptible to this, is that we're constantly pushing our students to say, well, why is that so? Or is that really good information? Or what about this argument? People have to develop a certain ability, I think, to kind of manage information. And not everyone is going to be able to do that. And so sometimes we have to trust others. I mean, I certainly don't have the knowledge that would allow me to make sort of general assumptions about medicine. I rely on people who are trained. So I think at some point you always, even with the internet, you have to come back to trusting somebody to be a fair arbiter of information for you.
This exchange reminds me of something that the late Father Adolfo Nicolas said in a speech in Mexico City 10 years ago to presidents of Jesuit universities. And he talked about the globalization of superficiality and how, it's because we can so easily find things that may or may not be factual on the internet. Jesuit education really has a responsibility to foster depth of thought. That's one of the things that's part of our tradition that we really need to focus on in this moment in the history of the world. And this connects a bit maybe to a question from Takahito Kamada, professor at Sophia University in Tokyo. He says this: how could we teach our undergraduate students more extensively the significance of individual commitments on collaboration, ethics, integrity, leadership, and the common good in undergraduate courses, not necessarily only in legal education or not in graduate school or not in professional education? Maybe more broadly, how do we as educators at a Jesuit school help students engage depth of thought in this way that is so much a part of our tradition?
That's really important and not an easy task. I guess something that I keep thinking about is maybe we need to think more deeply about how we create spaces and opportunities in the undergraduate experience for curiosity and the kind of conversations amongst students themselves that really, where the students feel confident and comfortable enough with one another that they can challenge each other around ideas, or they can express curiosity about something they don't know and share an experience of learning about it together. Is it, through sort of shared interest houses or living learning communities? I don't know how you do this, but I know when I was in college, and I was really interested in learning, improving my French, and then I went to France for my junior year. Well, there was French House, and I could go to French House and go to a cocktail party where I could only speak French, or a dinner party where I had to speak French, and meet French students and learn the language better and, improve my speaking. And there was something exciting about sort of stepping out of my normal everyday and, sort of throwing myself into this immersion on campus around something that was interesting to me. And you could do it in all kinds of different ways. There were all kinds of experiences on campus like that. So maybe we, as the academics and administrators that run universities, need to think a little more creatively about providing opportunities for our students to take risks intellectually and to express, curiosity and, other kinds of intellectual thoughtfulness in sort of controlled spaces that we create for them, but that we don't really control. We've just put in the ecosystem so that they can do that. I don't know, if that's that. I'm sure that's not easy to do, but I think that's something we could try to do more of.
Yeah, I think we've tried to do some of it in some of the new core courses that we've put together with enduring questions courses and complex problems courses to try to create that conversation, that sense of mutual engagement around important questions.
Well, we've got time for one more question, I think, and it's from Dennis Wiebolt, a sophomore, who is asking, in a hyper-plural religious environment, how can we best use our faith to advocate for the common good? Can we use our faith, or do we have to use only secularized tools?
Well, I think you have to use both, right? And you have to think carefully about how you come up with the right mix for the right situation. But I think our faith gives us so much. It's not just about sort of saying to someone dogmatically, these are the rules, this is how you should live. It's also living it yourself, right? I mean, being an example of what a really meaningful commitment to the beliefs that we have, what that represents. I think people are drawn to people like that. I was very privileged to participate on a fundraising event for the Catholic Charities here in Boston, and we honored Sister Norma Pimentel from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. And she just gave her life to serving migrants on the border. She doesn't ask any questions. She just wants to help give them life. And her example is so overwhelming that, a lot of people in Texas who are relatively conservative on immigration issues feel very honored to be in her presence, because her values are they just pour from her. And her love of other human beings is a huge example to all of us about what it means to be a Christian for her. So, I mean, that's a very dramatic example, but I think, if we really believe in, that community is important to us, and that, not being totally ruled by our individual needs and desires is a great expression of our faith, then we need to be living it out. We need to be doing things that demonstrate what that means and why that's a better way. Why when we do that, our society and our communities are stronger, our democracy is healthier, people are better taken care of. So, it's a big ask, I know, but I think it's something we can do. And if we all did it, and in small ways, I bet we'd see right away some wonderful manifestations of those values.
Thanks, Vince. I think with that, we have to bring this conversation to an end. As Kathy said at the outset, Vince and Kathy and I have known each other for a long time, and these issues that we've been talking about have been kind of at the heart of our ongoing conversation. So I'm grateful to both of you for engaging this conversation tonight. Thanks to my co-host, Kathy Keaveney, and thanks, Vince, for being our guest tonight. As we sign off, I want to preview the next episode of the show at 6. It'll be focused on BC sustainability, featuring Bruce Dixon, the Sustainability and Energy Management Specialist from Facilities Services, Anne-Marie Green, a student in the class of, a senior, I guess, and a graduate this year, class of 20, and then Julie Stelmazek, Manager of Regional and Sustainable Food Systems from Boston College Dining Services. The host of that conversation will be Tara Pisani-Garreau, Associate Professor of the Practice and Director of the Environmental Studies Program. That will be on July 31st on Friday from 6 to 7 p.m. As a reminder, you need to register for each segment of the show at 6 that you want to attend. As you know, registration is a very brief process, but each segment has a different webinar link. So please check out our webpage, bc.edu/show-at-6, and see the next segments. When you're there, check out our archives where all of our previous segments are posted. As the evening comes to an end, be well and stay safe. Good night from Boston College. Thanks to all.
Good night, everyone.
Night.